This is the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. Hi everyone, welcome to the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. My name is Angelica and I am your host. I'm joined today by Helen Simmons. Thank you very much, Helen, for joining us and sharing this space with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So Helen is a senior lecturer in education at the University of Northampton. And I have here behind me the recently published book by Helen and Philippa Thompson, which is on partnership with parents in early childhood today. And what Helen will be sharing with us is a chapter from the book around the politics of parenting. So we'll be discussing that topic and kind of seeing where it leads us and trying not to go too much off tangent because there's lots and lots of things that we can discuss. And it is a very big topic. So Helen, I think it might be good for you to start by giving a little introduction of your work, I guess, maybe more recent work around parenting and parenthood.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah. So thank you. My research kind of interest, I suppose, developed from my own professional experience. So after completing an early childhood studies degree a long time ago, I worked as a nanny and I worked as an early years educator before I moved into further and higher education. And then I became a parent myself, which sort of made me think quite differently about practice and around support for parents, especially. So my research sort of focused on motherhood, actually. This was for my doctoral research. And then that sort of drove me into looking at the politics of parenting, which, thinking about recent political directives around family hubs, but also before that with 1001 Critical Days and other things, we really see the spotlight being shone on parents, which is great because, before that there wasn't much policy for the 0 to 3 age range. There wasn't that attention. So anything that does shine that kind of spotlight and recognise the importance of that very young child and development and brain development and such is great. However, I think, from a sort of practitioner perspective, and something we all work hard with our students who are going into practice, is to try and just encourage them to think critically about the messages in policy, and particularly some of the language that's used around parenting that doesn't necessarily always recognise that parenting, isn't context free. We talk about the unique child. That goes for parents as well. Parents have different experiences, have different needs. And so it's just the chapter in the book and my own work kind of really just try to unpick some of those messages and think about, well, what do parents really need help with? And are they getting that at the moment? So that's kind of where those conversations with Philippa came from, and all the different chapters of the book kind of do a similar sort of thing, look at how to promote partnerships with parents that are meaningful and respectful and inclusive, essentially.
Yeah, and I think what often is missed, like you mentioned, is that every family and every parent or carer is unique as much as the child is. And it is our duty of care as educators to support the family as well as the child. I think often what's missed is that emotional support for the family, and really being able to tune in to the parents as much as you tune into the child.
Yeah.
And is that something that you feel we need a lot more support with as new educators, perhaps the students on that you teach? Do they need a lot more kind of input around that in terms of working with families and not just children, because primarily the focus is on children?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think new educators are under a lot of pressure, particularly around, meeting developmental milestones and getting children to the next stage. And what can sometimes happen, I think, is that pressure means that we sometimes miss the person at the heart of that support. And whilst the textbook might say children learn in this, in this way or in these different stages, we know the reality is different. And so we have to recognise that we have to put the textbook down sometimes and see the sort of the person at the heart of that. As I mentioned, I think a lot of the time that comes down to empathy, comes down to identity, finding ways to support a family in a way that might not be the same as the family before or the child before, recognizing that there isn't a formula. We can try and sort of develop parenting courses or education programs, but that's not necessarily going to help. What new mothers were telling me in my research, and still are in some research that we're doing at the moment, is people want to be seen. They want to feel seen. They want somebody who knows their name, not so-and-so's mom, or that at that level, and they want support that is honest and open and meaningful in that sense, rather than something that's sort of a recipe for good parenting or things which doesn't really exist.
And I guess that kind of taps into those that emotional side of being a mother in particular, in terms of the identity side of things, like you mentioned. But then it does put a lot of pressure on the educator, because they almost act as a bit of a therapist, I guess, at times. There's a lot of roles that educators play, and that is certainly one of them, emotional support. And as you mentioned, identity, I guess many mothers find that they do become that mother figure and are identified as the mum, the child's mum, but actually they lose themselves in that. And although it's such a fantastic kind of new role and part of your identity, at the same time, if you lose yourself and your own identity as a person rather than just a mother, I say just, like I say, it's such a great thing, but then it becomes something that affects you more negatively.
Yeah, and I think it's just understanding the sort of the realities, really. And I think, with courses like ours, early childhood studies degrees across the country, I think what we've become very conscious of is using the theory in a way that complements the reality of, and recognizing that it has its limitations. We need to really understand, at 3:00 in the morning, what does a mother, what are they Googling? What are they looking for help with? And fathers as well. What are those kind of pressures? What are the realities? What are the real issues? And how finding ways that meet those needs, rather than anything that's or driven by other priorities. It's about where are parents getting help? What do they need help with? What is not happening at the moment around maybe sort of support for identity, and helping people find local support, things that are easy to reach, and provide support outside of the home as well. It might be around career development. It might be around skills development, things that maybe we did in the past and we're trying to come back to a little bit with planning provision within local communities that sort of meets the needs of the people within it.
So I guess going back to my point on educators feeling a lot of pressure to support new families, parents or mothers, it's about pinpointing what support is already out there or they can provide in terms of that connection, rather than the educator thinking that this is the pressure that I need to take on myself to support the family on my own. It's that multi-agency work and collaborating with different organizations and agencies to pinpoint families towards.
Yeah. I mean, we know that, early childhood practitioners are under a lot of pressure. And I think the more opportunities for for practitioners to work together to develop professional networks can only be a good thing. We know there's been some great examples in the past, and there's a real focus on continuing professional development. That still, I think, it tends to kind of move towards a sort of primary sort of teaching side of things, and we'd like, be great to have more research opportunities for practitioners to actually have a go at developing research networks within their own settings and outside of those settings as well, to develop those kind of professional communities where they can share their own sort of those pressures and things that we've talked about there as well.
And that makes me think of existing networks and parent groups out there. Do you find that there are a lot of them that are set up by parents themselves and they're a bit separate to the education side of things? Because I think maybe there is that kind of those power dynamics and that hierarchy and the pressure that some new parents in particular may feel around having that connection to an educational establishment. And then that's why maybe those more informal mother baby groups or father networks are set up.
Yeah, and I think anything again in that sort of local community is really important, because from my experience and from the listening to parents, people don't always know where to go to find that support. There is social media and things are shared on social media, but things don't always get to the people who need them at that time. We've all seen things too late. Whereas actually, if those things can be shared more widely, I think parents are very good at finding networks, and I think social media has played a big part of it. But also things like WhatsApp. Mothers that I've spoken to and fathers I've spoken to have talked about WhatsApp groups, particularly from sort of antenatal groups and things there as well. I think sometimes that can become a bit of a double-edged sword. People have mentioned having to come away from that at times because it becomes quite overwhelming when it's or maybe a little bit intrusive sometimes, but actually it's also a source of support, and it's other adults as well. Particularly I think for families with very young children, you don't always have those networks or those links to other adults. And I think particularly thinking about during COVID and post COVID, that the sort of the communication and that interaction, the damage that I think was done during that time, I think we're only sort of scratching the surface of, around mental health and from families, children and parents as well. So I think anything where families can have sort of parent-led opportunities to share experiences and things that they're where they're listened to properly, rather than anything that's sort of too formulaic or sort of top down or too heavily driven by external factors, things that relate to what families are saying they need help with it at that moment.
Just quickly, I wanted to thank all the listeners for tuning into the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. Those of you who are regular listeners will know that a new episode comes out every Monday morning, ready for your commute, morning coffee, or that reflective start to the week to get you thinking and in the zone. If you haven't already done so, it would really help this podcast to keep going if you subscribe to the channel that you're listening on. The Voice of Early Childhood podcast can be found on 19 different podcast platforms and on YouTube. So it's highly likely that you, your friends, and colleagues can find it on your favorite streaming platform. So please do hit the subscribe button, and this will help us to keep putting out thought-provoking, reflective, and insightful episodes with a wide range of guests. Thank you. I'll let you get back to the episode now. Yeah, because I think it's a fine balance between providing support and parents, especially new parents, feeling lectured and told what to do. And there's a fine line there, because that reduces their confidence even more. They need that support. So like you said, if the support network or like a meeting is more parent led, then it's more about listening to the parent rather than necessarily telling them what they may already know or making them feel as if they're not adequate enough. Yes,
absolutely. Yeah. So to give an example that I've spoken to, it was mothers in this instance who'd attended parenting courses. And they didn't really talk about the content of the courses. When they reflected on them, it was what was memorable was, I met this person there and we've become really, good friends, and we can be honest with each other and we can find the humor in it, in everything. It's not the week where we learned about brain development. It was the week where actually we all just said, this is really tough. We were really frustrated. I've not had any sleep, and, I'm really struggling with breastfeeding. It's about, again, as you said, it's not lecturing people, because what all that's going to do is make things harder. People are ultimately doing their best, and to be able to be open and honest and have adult interaction, from what I've heard and I've experienced, is a lot more meaningful than anything that's too grounded in a rigid sort of 6-week course. And so much of it comes down to the practitioner, and as you mentioned, the pressure that practitioners are under. I think they need support with this as well, proper support, in terms of pay and status and professional development. There is a lot that can be done, and it's such a fundamental role, because I think sometimes that can be the difference between an experience that's really positive and something that does kind of maybe leave families sometimes feeling inadequate or under pressure or judged, or some of those other things.
Yeah, and like you said, it's about human connection, isn't it? And not necessarily giving the actual research or theory behind things. It's about having those empathetic discussions, and it's about that true communication, and this having that space where they feel safe and heard. And what would be, I think, an issue that is often seen is there are people out there, but maybe more so family members, that have got or had children themselves, and then they try and support a new parent, but then they do so with the best intentions, but actually they may make that new parent kind of feel small, and they're telling them what to do, and like you said, maybe make them feel like they're being judged. If I guess if an educator, or if someone sees that happening, how could they, I don't know, divert the conversation, or have a conversation in the first place to say, we need to be mindful of how we are communicating that? Because I feel like there's such a sensitive topic, everyone can get a little bit offended, because like I said, the intention is there in the best possible way.
Yeah. I think it's I always come back to empathy, really. I think so I don't believe that you need to be a parent to support parents. I think sometimes there's not many professions that you would hear that in. So why do we hear that in our sector? I think you need to be able to have empathy for people and see past the policy and the milestones and whatever else. And just try and find the person at the heart of it. I think if you're asking, if you hear certain things, is that kind of what you mean around if a practitioner was
to hear perhaps colleagues, a family member, or maybe another colleague, perhaps even in the staff room, in the setting, maybe an educator in the setting is a new parent themselves. And although they do have all of that developmental kind of knowledge around children, because they work with children every day, they're still seen as that new parent. So they're being almost lectured on how to be a parent, and instead of being made to feel like they're being supported, actually they ultimately may feel like they're being judged. I think that's such a difficult place to be in. I mean, I personally haven't been there myself because I don't have children, but I guess standing on the outside with that third person perspective, you kind of see that happening, and you think, oh gosh, like they're really trying hard to to provide some kind of advice, but actually the new parent or carer is actually feeling judged and feeling quite small.
Yeah, because everyone's got an opinion on everything, essentially, and I think there's a great model. I'm sure you've used it with students as well, the Johari windows. It's quite an old model now, but essentially it's brilliant. And it is that those reflective techniques like that, where you try and think about your own values, your own belief systems, your own assumptions, things that and it is a real sort of spotlight or like window to, your own, the barriers that might come out for you for supporting families and things as well. And I hear, people have opinions on the use of dummies or on breastfeeding in public or on, so many different things. There's not much, I think, that people wouldn't have an opinion on in relation to parenting. And that does translate into, we've talked about intergenerational kind of things as well around listening to the experiences that people have had, but ultimately recognizing that we need to support parents to be confident in their own decisions, to see that they are the people who know their children the best. This whole kind of notion of expert is something that is always interesting when it comes to parenting, because really the only expert in that relationship are the parents and the families involved. There's from an early childhood perspective, we can be there to support and provide a space and listen, but recognize that we're not the experts. The family is. I think there's knowing that in one day you might have 10 pieces of advice given to you about a particular topic, and at the end of the day it's going to have to come down to filtering and having the confidence to filter that advice and those opinions in a way that's not going to have an adverse effect in terms of mental health.
And I was going to also tap into fatherhood as well, and as you mentioned motherhood quite a lot because that is your research. What about making fathers feel kind of more welcome into that's co-parenting space, and again also not feeling judged, because that's maybe that we don't necessarily account for fathers or male figures feeling judged as much as mothers do.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, and especially with the development of family hubs at the moment, to recognise fathers as maybe there's challenges there around entering spaces that may be seen as spaces for women, and the stigma that maybe is attached to that, whether we see it as there or not, it is something that needs to be considered. And so for policymakers and for those involved in the development of that provision, there is an opportunity there to really try and ensure that fathers and men feel welcome in those spaces as well. And I think this what that requires is actually listening to the experiences of fathers, so they can be heard in terms of where the challenges are and what would help as well, sort of strategies that might help.
And it kind of goes back to what we briefly mentioned in terms of feeling like you are in a safe space, and how would we communicate that if we were a service provider for new families or parents, or perhaps an educator in a setting who've created a parent kind of stay and play session? Like, how would we communicate that to someone who hasn't ever been before? So I guess it taps into what we used to call hard to reach parents, perhaps, and now we know that's not really the right kind of way of seeing them, or it's not the right term to use. But how do we support those families and parents who may be kind of harder to engage with and get on board because they may not be as comfortable, or maybe a little bit skeptical, or just new to the whole experience? How do we really communicate this is a safe space before they've got there?
Yeah, I do. And I think it's, that's one of the hardest things, I think, in terms of how we get the messages out there, and how the activities that do exist and the things that are being planned at the moment, how we make sure families know about it and know that know that it is a safe space, and that's there. And I think there's a multi-agency aspect there. I think that, you know, the professionals need to work together within that, you know, from a sort of health and early childhood perspective and an education perspective. And the more that can happen, and the more that those sort of experiences or sessions or resources or activities can be shared in a way, you know, whether it's through schools, social media, through health visiting, through, you know, that's where services need to work together. I'm really think, because I do think that's one of the biggest challenges, is how do families find out about things in the first place, and then feel comfortable, confident, to attend and to go, because I think that's the hardest thing, isn't it? It's going into a space is usually the biggest challenge,
and having that trust that you are going to be supported and listened to, and it is a safe space, because they may be safe spaces, hopefully, you know, and that's the aim. And we don't know how parents and families will feel until they are there. And then, you know, having that true communication, that open communication, will allow us to understand that maybe something that we are doing can be done better to make them feel more safe. But where does that maybe notion of insecurity come from, in terms of maybe insecurity isn't the right word, but that doubt in that this might not be a safe space, or maybe it comes back to what I mentioned earlier in terms of the hierarchy element of, you know, this is a educational space, or this is a health kind of a health kind of dominated field, and parents don't feel like they are experts in any way. So it might be around that communication that they receive from anywhere and everywhere, that they, you know, anyone they communicate with, whether it be family members who, like we mentioned earlier, who may try to support them, but in a way which may not be received in the most supportive kind of way, and they feel judged. It kind of goes back to that wider societal issue of parents or families not feeling like they know very much, because they're so new to having children.
And it does, you know, it comes down to relationships, you know, and when relationships are grounded in divisions of power, it's never going to work. You know, if people feel that they're going to be lectured, or they're going to be or they can't be honest. You know, I remember somebody telling me, well, I just wasn't honest about, you know, I'd started weaning early and I just didn't tell them because I just didn't want to be told that I'd done something wrong. And so it creates silences, and that's never going to then be helpful, because it's not real, you know. And so and it, you know, so much of it does come down to the experiences of individuals. You know, a lot of people said, once I met so-and-so, talking about a practitioner or a family support worker or a health visitor or an early years educator, that changed everything, because they told me about these sessions and I went along and they were there and I felt really comfortable. And, you know, it becomes a lifeline a lot of the time, and I don't think it can be underestimated how important that is. And I do agree that puts a lot of pressure on practitioners, because, you know, there is a sort of therapeutic element to that, and there is a sort of social work element to that, and that's really challenging. And there's so much amazing practice out there, you know, with people that are doing this already. And I think the more we can share those experiences and the positive impact that it has, I think the better.
It goes back to what you mentioned about the importance of multi-agency working and collaboration, and then really coming together to be able to, like you say, share the brilliant work that's happening, and also the experiences of families who use these services. So it's just about communicating far and wide about the great support that exists, and then that gaining that feedback from families, whether it is positive or negative. You know, if it is more negative or constructive, we can then do something about it to provide even better, more targeted support. And if it is positive, then it is showcasing to other families that this is something that you can also gain support from and reassurance, and it is a safe space.
Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of Wendy Kettleborough's work, at Mannering Castle, around that sort of parents are experts, and that it is that partnership with families. Once they feel, I think, like anybody in any part of life, once you feel you're heard, you feel that you're valued, everything becomes a lot more meaningful and a lot more sort of, you feel respected, and other things that we mentioned earlier about identity as well. All parents had a story before they became parents, and that doesn't go away. Once you become a mother or a father or parent, carer, grandparent, whatever. So it's about recognizing the person at the heart of it all.
Yeah, that is really important, to not forget that every adult is still unique, just as we talk about the unique child in the early years. Okay, well, I think we'll round it off there, Helen. It's been great to be able to kind of dig a little bit deeper into a topic like this, and really focus in on like the identity aspects and hierarchy and those kind of emotional feelings and safety and listening. So our listeners can find out more on the Voice of Early Childhood website. And thank you very much again, Helen, for joining and sharing your time with us and sharing this space.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Angelica. Thank you for having me.